Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our Stories of Pensacola, North America's first place city. These last few episodes we've been dealing with the British times in Pensacola, and as we left off last time, the situation had become rather grave here because now Spain had entered the war against on behalf of the French, but focusing all of their attention on one thing, recapturing and reclaiming what had been Spanish Florida, which of course had been British Florida for the past 18 years. Now in charge of the Spanish operations at New Orleans were General Bernardo de Galvez with a much enlarged military force, while at Pensacola we had General Sir John Campbell, who had been joined by two companies of loyalists, another company of British regulars, and now also they got about 750 men and women who were what we call Waldeckers. Now these were like the Hessians, which most people have heard about in their history books. The Waldeckers were from a province in Germany and were leased soldiers who had been leased for the British cause by King George III. As they came in here, these Waldeckers were led by Colonel von Hazelton, Lieutenant Colonel von Horn, and Major Prenser, and there were about 750 of them, and they also brought their wives. Many of them had their wives with them. And they set up camp on the southeastern corner of the property of Fort George, up about what we would call Lee Square area today. It's sort of interesting. These folks literally, it was common practice to bring their wives along. The wives were in their tents, and they simply made this a home. And just as a side story, there's one story that says that in 1779 or 1780, one or the other, we're not sure which, it may have been that these Waldeckers introduced the Christmas tree, or the custom at least, to Pensacola because they were used to doing this at home. They cut small pines, put them up in front of their tents, and so enjoyed them. And Pensacola's townspeople, visitors, came out and saw them, and they liked what they saw. But unfortunately, the British would soon be gone to enjoy the custom further. Okay. We now have a significant number of people here for the defense of the community. All told, the British program, the British defense, would have about almost 2,500 people, and that would include about 200 Creek Indians who kind of came and gone, along with a few of the Choctaws who were friendly to the British, and there were about 250 black men enrolled with the British cause. Some of them had been slaves, most of them had been slaves held in the colony, but others had been free men who joined the cause as fighters as well. Okay, we're ready to look at what General de Galvez was about to do. His first plan, of course, was to try and take the British outposts along the Mississippi River. And late in 1779, he put his armed force together. They marched overland, and they very quickly subdued Natchez, Baton Rouge, Fort Butte, and Manchac, and literally put these people under Spanish rule. Now they were ready to march on the second objective, which would be Mobile. And it took a little while for them to get organized for that because, once again, the officials in Cuba insisted on overwhelming superiority. And of course, their spies finally told them that there really wasn't much of a defense at Mobile itself. But General Campbell sent a few people there, and they were under the command generally of Colonel Elias Durnford, of course, who has been with our story almost from the very beginning. We won't delve with the battle there. It was a relatively short one. Casualties were few, and the British were defeated. And with this, of course, de Galvez did something rather unusual. He permitted the British officers to return to Pensacola. He interned all of the enlisted men and others that were part of their force, and they were removed from what Campbell had available to him. Included in that loss were about 200 of the Waldeckers who had been at Mobile. Okay, everyone now expected that the Spanish would quickly attack Pensacola. But once again, the folks in Cuba put the brakes on de Galvez, said, no, you still do not have the numerical superiority that we want. Consequently, you've got to wait until we put it together properly. And they did. De Galvez was furious at this, but he had to wait. And it was August once again, we're in 1780, August of that year, before his fleet finally began its move toward Pensacola. Well, August in any year is a suspect time for Pensacola, and sure enough, as that fleet was en route to this area, a great storm struck the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know whether it was a hurricane, but it was sufficiently strong that it dispersed de Galvez fleet, and they were forced to return to their respective ports, and it took several months before they could put everything back together again. But now, early into 1781, they are ready to come. And now de Galvez and his fleet approaches, and they have altogether, counting Indians and other allies that they have, but plus about 650 French troops, they now have a force of just about 7,500 men, about 3 times what the British defenders numbered. And so they approach, and de Galvez, of course, has scouted the area very carefully. He knows this, that the opening into the bay is suspect. It may be shallow at certain times of the day, and of course the Spanish were very, very much afraid of losing a ship running it aground. Secondly, the British had mounted cannon up on what they called the barrancas, the high point from which they could shoot down toward vessels trying to enter the bay. So Galvez was aware of this, and he was being very careful. So his first movement was to place a group of troops not on the mainland, not on the where NAS would be today, or where the early Spanish colony had been. No, they landed troops on Santa Rosa Island itself, and that was their first placement. And then it took days before they got everything organized, other troops marching overland, the Navy coming in. But then, at a key point, the several captains of his fleet just refused to try to enter the bay. They were afraid of those cannon. They were afraid of the depth of the water. Galvez got on board the flagship, and for about 3 days, the captains just argued. And finally, Galvez used his rank. He insisted that the captain proceed. They went through the opening. The cannon fired at them. They were scared to death they would run aground, but they didn't. The ship moved in safely. The cannon did not hit them. And so quickly, once they're inside the bay, Galvez sends a messenger by small boat back to the rest of the fleet, saying, see, there was nothing to it. I alone, yo solo, I have done it. Now, you all come behind me. And one by one, the ships did. Now, this story from that point on becomes rather involved. There is a series of movements as the Spanish move into Pensacola Bay, and they are being opposed not only by the troops in Fort George, but also several British warships, the Mentor and the Port Royal particularly, which were pretty well armed. But as the Spanish ships moved in, the captains of those British ships realized that they were no match for the superior size of the Spanish. So the British fleets were unloaded. They took the cannon off to be used, and then the 2 vessels were burned. But now the British set up their defense in Fort George. Meanwhile, as Peter Chester is here, a meeting is called between him and Governor Chester and General Sir John Campbell. They gather together and they declare that Pensacola as a city will be an open city. It will not become involved in the fighting unless, of course, the English should choose to try to defend it house to house. And this, so that the people of Pensacola could sit back and watch the fighting and not be afraid of cannon fire or all the rest. Now, step by step, the Galvez force moves on land. They move a camp at a time, and basically, after just a short time, they begin to move into Bayou Chico. Now, as Pensacola people know Bayou Chico today, they might look at that story and say, well, now how in the world could they do that? The entrance to Bayou Chico is rather small, it's rather narrow, and sometimes it can be silted. How could they get a whole fleet in that bayou? But we must remember that the waters and tides do various things over centuries, and Bayou Chico was obviously configured somewhat differently then than it is today. The fleet did move inside, and they established the point in which the people could be brought into and onto the mainland and prepare for a siege. They used a building that was owned by a man named Neal, which was right on about where the Yacht Club house buildings are today. They used that as their headquarters to begin with, and then step by step, the Spanish forces were brought on land, and they began to move north and east toward Fort George. Now, this was a cumbersome process. This all began early in March, and through March and into April, they had several successive moves forward, and in each case, of course, they set up artillery that could pound the Fort George, and the people in Fort George could retaliate. Now, both sides had spies. Both sides had Indian aides that were going back and forth, kind of as terrorists to create havoc with the other side. But as things moved forward, gradually de Galvez moved step by step by step closer. Now, as all this was happening, he finally reached a point about to establish a fortress, a fort, right about where Gonzales Street and Spring are today in Pensacola. And they put together what became known as Fort San Bernardo. Now, this was a place where they could put cannon, particularly small mortars, and because they were firing at relatively short range at the British. And so the siege began. Now, both Sir John Campbell and Galvez, of course, used every military stratagem you can think of. They attacked here, they attacked there, they attacked by night. They even tried to use sappers or engineers to dig underneath the other parties' fortifications. That did not succeed in either case. Both armies were plagued by having deserters. And one of the stories, of course, comes that it was a Spanish deserter. A British deserter who ultimately led to the downfall of Fort George, but we can't be sure of that. But nonetheless, quite a large numbers of deserters went back and forth, and each one, of course, having tales to tell about what he had seen behind the lines. Okay, we move forward. We come into the early days of May, and now the armies are getting closer and closer together as de Galvez moves, and finally on the morning of May the 9th, a mortar shell fired from Fort San Bernardo strikes a powder magazine in the Queen Anne's Redoubt, creates a tremendous explosion. And the stories of casualties there vary depending on the report, but one says 50 soldiers were killed, another said 125, but in either case, the entire army was stunned, and within a matter of minutes, de Galvez troops began to rush forward into the gap that had been created by the explosion, and the British army was defeated. Well, General Campbell and Galvez came together. They agreed on terms of surrender. The British marched out, they stacked their arms, and the plans made for what was going to happen now in the future. And the first thing, of course, de Galvez wanted to get rid of the British army that was there, and so plans were made, and this was kind of an unusual arrangement. They arranged for the British officers to be sent generally in the direction of home in Britain. All of the enlisted personnel, excluding, of course, the Indians, all of these were put on Spanish warships and sailed on their way. They landed once in Key West. They made their journey up the Atlantic coast, and they took them all the way to New York City. Now, as all of this was happening in Pensacola, General George Washington was opposite General Cornwallis at Yorktown, and we were very close to the end, what became the final battle of the Great Revolution. Now, we have to always wonder what would have happened if those English soldiers from here could have gotten to the point of aiding Cornwallis there at Yorktown. It could have made a great change in the outcome of the Revolutionary War, but happily for the Americans, that did not happen. George Washington, a little bit later on, wrote a scathing letter to Galvez, asking him what in the world were you thinking about when you did that. But Galvez's response was very simple. He said, "Look, we're not your allies. We're here strictly to knock the British out of Florida." And that's the basic way it went. Well, when it was over, of course, the British and the Spanish came together. The question was now, what will happen to British residents who have come here as the colonists in Pensacola? And the Spanish said, "Look, we want you to stay. We want you to be part of the new Spain here. All you have to do, we'll protect all your other rights. All you have to do is join the Catholic Church." Well, that didn't happen. Virtually all of, not 100%, but virtually all of those who were resident here in Pensacola elected to go to either back to Great Britain, to a place in the Caribbean, or some other hospitable location. The farmers along the Mississippi apparently felt that the long arm of the church wasn't going to find them out there. Most of them stayed where they were, and they and their descendants were going to become the originators just a few years later of the great cotton economy along the Mississippi. And so the British period ended. Did it have any lasting values for it? Well, yes and no. We had some experiences here that illustrate how the British operated. Things that could have happened if things had gone differently. But in the end, the British were gone and the Spanish returned, and that's where we will pick up our story next time.